moths. And we'll go through a bunch of slides, but before we begin, in a normal situation, I would encourage, questions that you may have come here with. So please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them as we go through. If you have something sort of immediate as I'm going through the slideshow, you can use the chat feature, as Audrey said, and she and Carol will be watching that, and we'll speak up if there's a clarifying question that you have. With that, I'll start by saying that I have reached what I consider the final frontier in my investigations of the natural world, and that is, as most people call them, bugs. Entomologists have to have a certain degree of sort of sadomasochism operational in their personality types, because bugs, as they're known, are by and large the largest group of organisms that we know the least amount about, bar none. When we talk about the sixth extinction wave, we're largely talking about the extinction of invertebrates. Vertebrate extinction is slow, it's periodic, it's sort of punctuated by periods of low diversity loss to high diversity loss. But in terms of insects and all of the other invertebrates that support the higher life forms, that is to say the vertebrate life forms, this group really deserves, in my opinion, the most attention, because aside from the fact, as you've no doubt have heard, that they're going to take over the world when we're gone, they also provide an incredibly important ecosystem service function. And that's part of what I will share with you tonight about this aspect of the Lepidoptera, the moths. So I'll start by just, doing a brief introduction in terms of what moths are. And this may be a repeat for some of you, but hopefully there'll be a few pieces of information you haven't heard that you can plug your encyclopedic brain cells and kick back at your next dinner party and ask something about, what's that thing behind the light? Insects of the order Lepidoptera, that means scale-winged, is what the moths belong to. That order Lepidoptera is comprised of butterflies and moths, but there are three other suborders, as it were, that represent groups of organisms that are very close to related, as important, that we'll mention as we go through. The sort of physiology of a moth includes simple pectinate antennae that are not clubbed. Well, unlike butterflies and skippers, they do not have a noticeable swelling at the tip of those antennae. The pectinate means combed, and I'll show you some pictures of that. One of our more infamous members, the Gypsy Moths, have pectinate antennae, and I've got some photos of them as well. Most of the adults are nectar feeders, and herein lies one of their essential services for ecosystem integrity, and that is by providing much of the pollination of trees and shrubs. Oftentimes we think about butterflies as the group that really are the pollinators in the Lepidoptera, but by and large, with 1/10 or 1/11 the amount of diversity worldwide, the moths are far more important in terms of seeking nectaries in flowers of especially woody plants. But not all adults are nectar feeders. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But the larvae, as many of you know, are leaf chewers, and they can be living leaves or dead leaves. Some larvae, of course, chew up woody debris of other types, but for the most part, the larvae are living off one or more species of herbaceous or woody plants, and that's their principal sort of food source as they go through their life cycle. And most, as you are mostly likely aware, are night flyers. We do have a few day-flying moths that are very close to butterflies, that look like butterflies, but for the most part, if we want to see moths, we've got to be, as it were, a night owl. So this page is from John Himmelman's Discovering Moths book, which is provides a nice sort of pictorial, silhouetted diversity of the types of moths we have. And we'll go through some of these groups and point out some of the keynote members of each group. But as I talk in this slide, you can sort of scan those silhouettes and see the common types. Really, I think there's about 10 or 12 of them of the moths that you could see out your backyard tonight. Turn on the lights and watch them come. It's not too difficult since they are driven and attracted to various light forms. Like I said, as a Lepidoptera, they are clothed in scales. These scales average 1/10 of a millimeter in width or length. And so largely, not too visible to the naked eye. You pull out a hand lens and you can see them very clearly. If you take a nice iPhone macro shot, you can zoom in and see those scales layered over each other. And that's what gives the moths their both protection from the elements, some type of retention of bodily moisture and heat, even though they are largely poikilotherms, they still have some heat associated metabolism that's important for them to get about with, which is why on cold days you don't see moths flying too much. And then of course they have varying sizes as shown here these are largely the macro moths that he's depicted. And we have some of the small ones like the tortricids here, but they go from a couple of millimeters in length all the way up to about 55 or so millimeters. That'd be, 20 inches, I think, is the largest wingspan for a moth that we have recorded. We don't actually have that species. Our largest species are somewhere in the order of about 25 to 30 centimeters rather in width. Long antennae are typical for moths. Sometimes they're, like I say, pectinate, combed. Other times they're just straight segmented antennae. Although the segments are very small, you can't really count them or see them as you can in other insect groups. Generally brown or gray colors, but it's amazing, as you will see in some of the ensuing slides, how highly patterned and highly colorful some of these moths are. There are over 11,000 species in North America. We have at least 11,400 that have been named. In the Northeast, about 4,000 species, and there's an estimate of about 2,000 species in New Hampshire. I have personally logged in about 1,100 of those, and I'm slowing down in terms of what I can see in my back porch lights, but 1,100 is not too bad for one locale in one part of the state. So then hence, as we move out into other regions like the Alpine zone or down in the Pine Barrens and the coastal intertidal areas, we have other species that are common in those habitats. Hence, we've estimated about 2,000 species in the state. You can see some of the macro moths. We'll talk about those a little more specifically, and then what are considered the micro moths, the tinier ones. Not really so micro. I think this one on the upper left is about 3 millimeters long. So you can clearly see these guys, but for convention's sake, we do separate the larger guys from the small ones. So what are as I said, the caterpillars are largely chowing down on leafy parts of higher plants. They do hit some of our garden vegetables. Many of you have maybe heard of the looper moths, cabbage looper and that type of thing. Those are larvae of noctuids that are chewing on some of your vegetable leafy parts. They'll chow down on leaf litter. Certain groups are leaf litter obligates, and their whole life cycle is on the ground surface. Others are humus and organic debris chewers, and we even have some that I didn't list that are aquatic. We have just a few aquatic moths that live as larvae underwater and then emerge at the surface like a lot of other insects and live their adult flying life above the water. We have a few lichen obligates as well, the lichen moth, which is a fairly common one, and we see it regularly throughout the Northeast. That's their primary food source. So they've really adapted to the different types of foods that are available as caterpillars. The adults, as I said, are nectar eaters and all types. What I really find is fascinating that I learned early on in the sort of my exploration into the moth world when I started in 2008 was the fact that we've got a whole group that are largely obligate feeders on the nectar coming from grasses and sedges. And the grass veneer moth group, of which there are probably a couple dozen species in New Hampshire, is a pretty large one. And I guarantee if any of you have lawns out there, you have grass veneer moths in your lawn. I mean, they're active and feeding and flying during the day. You walk across the lawn. If you see these little whitish objects flying up, that's probably a grass veneer moth. And if you get close, you can see that they're real narrow and lightly patterned, like white and light brown, and they kind of, well camouflaged in that type of habitat. But as you've seen with things like various tiger moths and certainly not unlike some of the butterflies like eastern tiger swallowtail butterflies, some of our moth adults are mud eaters or sap consumers. Some of our earliest moths are actually out drinking the sap from trees that are just emerging from their winter slumber. And I know as a sugarer, it's sort of the sign of the season closing when sap moths, as they're called, come to the buckets and fall in. And it's sort of like if you imagine falling into a bucket of ice cream, and that was 20 times or 100 times your size. What a life that would be. And then of course, typically they drown unless you pick them out, and yeah, they don't taste too good. So we try and get them out of the buckets as soon as we can. There are some odd foods, I should say, that some adults will capitalize on, and it's largely mineral driven. Animal droppings are in that group of odd food sources. So,
hey Rick, can I interrupt?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
We just had a few questions that I thought would be good to address now. Someone was hoping you could explain what obligate means.
Yeah, obligate means that it has to. In a case feeding obligate, it has to feed on a certain type. Like the most famous, perhaps, is the Carner blue butterfly that lives only on wild lupin in the pine barrens of the Northeast. That's a butterfly, but we have moths that also have very specific obligate relationships with certain species of plants, and it makes them, pretty rare. And of course, the plant, if it's endangered, like the lupin is, makes the population of that insect rare. And was there another question, Audrey?
Denise had a question, but I'm going to guess that you're going to get to her question in a little bit. She was wondering about that pink moth you showed a picture of.
Oh yeah, the Rosy maple moth. Yeah, that's they're flying right now. I think last year my record was 320 different individuals at the porch light out back. So they can be super abundant, but they're never like gypsy moths. And that's one of the things that, if people know about moths, oftentimes they hear about them as serious defoliating pests. And certainly the gypsy moth is one of those. And even though there's a few leaves left on these trees in this picture on the left, take a look at the view from downtown North Conway at the Lowe's building. This is the Rattlesnake Ridge with Rattlesnake and Middle Mountain and Black Peak. So this is looking like winter, but it was taken just a couple of weeks ago. And here's the culprit here, as many of you know, and some perhaps of you will remember the 1981-82 outbreak. And that was at a time, keeping in mind that gypsy moth was, accidentally introduced in the 1800s, it really didn't get to be a strongly defoliating pest until the 1940s. And since that time, every 7 to 10 years, we have these so-called outbreaks. The last worst one was in the early 80s, as I said, and it was only checked by the outbreak, the corresponding upwelling growth and outbreak of a fungus that was attacking the larvae, interrupting its metabolism, and it effectively knocked back the gypsy moth from any subsequent large outbreak since that time in New Hampshire. But there have been these, pulses, as it were, in certain habitat types. Even in 2000 it was 2007 down in Hooksett, there was a pretty substantial outbreak of gypsy moth that I came across, but it was in a very young forest. And so it can isolate in these sort of spotty locales. For example, I don't have any in Sandwich that I know of. I haven't seen any evidence of it, but here in Conway and also up in Albany, extending up into Jackson and Bartlett, it's pretty substantial. And one of the keynote features in terms of the regulatory sort of balance between the fungus and the gypsy moth larva is weather. Is clearly whether or not we've got any rainfall. And the drought last year really knocked the fungus back, as dry weather tends to do. And as a consequence, as the UNH Cooperative Extension and other folks have announced on the radio, they suspect that the drought, both last year and the spring of this year, was responsible for this tremendous outbreak. So that's fortunately doesn't happen too much. Saddle prominent is another one you may have heard of. Spruce budworm. There are a number of potential serious pests to our timber industry as a result of these periodic outbreaks. So in general, just to sort of go over the life cycle, start out as an egg. You can see some eggs here from a captured moth that was, held in a container, and she laid eggs right very happily in that container. And I released these guys and they hatched out into a small larva, which then, of course, this particular species doesn't really get to a mature larval state until about the end of May. And by then it's consuming pretty much most of whatever leafy greens they can get to. As I said, it varies from very specific obligate feeding relationships to ones that are very tolerant of a variety of different species. At some point, the larva will mature to its last stage or instar and develop into a pupa. And the pupa, or pupae in plural, are effectively a resting state wherein the chemical and biological sort of transformation of the larval tissues becomes a sort of a prenuptial adult, as it were. And the pupa can last, typically most moths have pupae that overwinter, and then the adult emerges in the spring. But that can also vary quite a bit among the 2,000 species we've got or so. And sometimes it's completely reversed, where the pupa will actually hatch in the late fall, and the moth will fly just at the advent of winter, and go through their cycle, lay their eggs just as the snow is falling. So it can really vary across the months of the year. In terms of sort of the caterpillar, you can see a little bit of the sort of schematic of the parts. Typically, they have 3 legs, 1 pair for each thoracic segment, which immediately is posterior to the head capsule, which typically has a single pair of eyes and sometimes some ancillary ocelli, which is what this word, those are sort of pseudo eyes, they're sensory organs that don't have the complex nerve endings that a true eye has. They do have some breathing apparatus, some of them called spiracles on the lateral median of the abdominal segments. And in the case of hornworms or Sphinx Maws, you have this little odd shaped, what they assume to be as a predator defense spine. That's not very common, but it does happen. And then usually they have some type of series of abdominal prolegs that allow them to grasp onto objects, as you can see here with the Polyphemus moth walking across the surface of this rotten log. So that's sort of the 4 stages of this very typical insect life cycle, not unlike most of our flies and hornets and bees and beetles and so forth. So in terms of the seasonal variations, as I said, most of the species have eggs, larvae, and sometimes adults in the winter. By spring, there's usually an emergence. And depending upon when the flight period is, the eggs may be laid or hatching in the spring and then feeding on the developing growth of a variety of different vegetation throughout the growing season. Lynn Scott, who's done a great deal of sort of observations of moths in her area in Ontario, put together this month-by-month occurrence of certain species, of all species that she's recorded for her area. And just one, as an example, has a flight period, as you can see, starts in May and runs through pretty much the end of June. And for these small guys, the white pine cone borer, that's not atypical. It's about a 3, sometimes a 4-week flight period for one brood. But as you get into some of the other species, you might have 2 broods where you'd see the same pattern repeated down in September, October. Typically, it's 1 brood for the larger moths like the Saturnids and the Sphinxes, but the small ones and the medium-sized ones often have 2 broods a year. So another group of moths, in this case, Noctuats, overwinter as adults, and then they emerge. As I said, the sap moth group, the Lithophanies and or Lithophanies and Upsilias, like this guy right here, will be flying as soon as it reaches about 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside. And it's amazing how they're well adapted to that time period. In fact, one of the hardships they face is if it warms up too fast, and you lose the sort of nectar resources on the budding red maples and so forth. That can be a real problem. But this year it wasn't too bad in terms of a rapid warm up. It just was very dry. And then in this variation sort of set, you get a lot of our geometers, which is like this guy right here, the Macaria, Eutropilas. These are all inchworm types, right? Most people know geometer by the common name inchworm, and that refers to the larvae, of course, that has a big loop as they crawl across the surface of some tree or twig or something like that. And then we have in the late spring a lot of our silk moths, which is exemplified by this one right here, the Antheria Polyphemus, or one of our second largest moth. I think it's a real toss-up with Cecropia. Some of you may have heard of the Cecropia moth. Between Polyphemus and Cecropia, we've got almost a 6-inch wingspan here. And that's just gigantic. They're like bats when you see them flying around. And if they do come to your porch lights, you can't miss them because they'll just blot out the light as they hit the porch light, and then hopefully set up shop overnight. And in the morning, you can come out and see some of these guys. They're absolutely gorgeous. Just fantastic patterns on their wings. These 2 rear discal spots are actually sort of like cellophane in the middle, so it transmits light. So you can have actually light coming through these openings. And again, this is a sort of a predator defense concept. I might say a smiling predator defense concept. So they're a really neat group, the silk moths. And of course, their name came from the famous silk moth of Asia that many of us have heard about or read about, in the same family, Saturnidae. In the summer and the fall, things like this one, the pale beauty moth, Campia, comes out, and these are just stunning. You can shine a light through this and it actually comes, if you're underneath it, the light is green when it comes up through the moth. It's just a stunningly beautiful translucent species. And there's, all kinds of reasons for that, but nonetheless, the beauty is just, something to behold. So we'll go through some of the major groups so you get a concept of the diversity of moths we have out there. There are obviously, as I say, quite a few. One order, 5 suborders, 23 subfamilies. You can see the list here. And that has changed as we've sort of gotten into the DNA work that has attended most of the species. I think, I'm not sure how many species have actually been fully genotyped, but many of the confusing groups, the ones that look alike, have all gone to DNA. Which is actually a little easier than trying to identify them by female reproductive parts, which has been the sort of, with the advent of the microscope, or at least powerful enough dissecting scope, that's been the primary separating or distinguishing feature until DNA sort of came about 20 years ago. But nonetheless, we do have quite a few, and they're 1983, the Hodges list sort of set the bar, and then Jerry Pohl in 2016 updated that effectively, and because there were so many changes to the taxonomy, he created a new numerical system that many of us use. Just to give you a little bit of a sort of a taxonomic breakdown, what they call a cladogram for the moths in North America. You can see the different groups. This is one long cladogram, and each of these groups have the number of known species associated with them. And you can see some are pretty small, very distinctly isolated taxonomically, but others, like when we get down to the Noctuats, you have nearly 3,000 species, and this is North America wide. So and for us, I think we have probably about 350 Noctuids in New Hampshire. So it's the largest group, but you can see the numbers. It really is quite various. And just for reference sake, in this list, they separate out the micros from the macros. And here again, you see it's about 11,000 species total. It's been named, at least when this was last updated, which is a few years ago. Because it's more than 11,000 now. But it gives you a sense of how many different micro moths there are versus the macro moths. So these are the ones that are more famous, more visible. Here's your Saturns or silk moths. These guys are the huge ones, but there are many, many more small ones. And keep in mind that all these groups have evolved to live in certain habitat types, and in fact, certain microhabitat types. And as I said, it's not just a question of having a larva living only on, say, a goldenrod species, but then you have, very specific mouth parts that these guys have developed that feed and help pollinate certain flowers by, going after their nectaries. So it's kind of a interesting sort of, realm is to think about how all of these have developed. By the way, here's your butterfly and skipper group, which are largely, they are in the micro, as it were, moth, more closely related to the micro moths, but they have their own distinct taxonomy, and they're, fairly numerous, but a relatively small percentage of the total number of moths, even though they're not moths technically. So again, visually, you can see these guys are small, the micros, the macros are larger as a general rule. Some more micro moths here that you might see both on vegetation around your house, especially now that we're into the sort of full growing season, summer season. But some you may see, come out for just a couple of weeks and hit your porch lights, and that's it. You'll never see them out in the woods. Some of them, like this guy right here, is super common after the snow melts. It's the first Sometimes it's the first moth I see in the spring, and certainly it's the first micro moth that I see in the spring. Then others, like this guy right here, is an obligate feeder on pitch pine. That's all it eats, pitch pine. Whereas these other ones, this one is a fern eater, as is this one. These guys are kind of related. So again, we have all these different types that have a varying amount of feeding habits, as it were. And here are some of the common names: leaf roller, and leaf miner. These are relating to how the larvae develop, typically at the point of becoming a pupa. So they'll roll up a leaf edge to become a pupa and then emerge from that as an adult. That's in this family. Leaf miners have those little tiny they go between the upper and lower cortex of a leaf. They kind of mine in between those layers and form a cocoon. And that's their sort of claim to fame. And we see these leaf miners, again, pretty commonly on most of our hardwood or deciduous leaved trees. And then we've got others that are, like I said, habitat specific. This is water milfoil cutter moth. And as a larva, they live underwater, and that's what they chew. They chew on water milfoil. And we've got a number of different, I think it's 5 native species of water milfoil in the state, and then 2 non-natives. And they're pretty common where you have a lot of water milfoil. But you wouldn't imagine seeing this little whitish green larvae underwater emerging as these pretty attractive adults and then flying about the marshes in early summer. This is one of those grass veneer moths, and you can see this one's only about 1 millimeter across, and boy, you can lose these guys if you're walking through a hayfield. It's hard to see until you flush them out. And then you see this light colored object that's no more than a 1/2 inch long flying away. And it's a pretty significantly large group of micromoths in this superorder Pyrroloideum. We have some that are just absolutely easy to identify at a distance without a hand lens or binoculars. This funeral moth, so-called, is blackish with white spots. I'm not actually sure how it got the name funeral moth. It's actually part of its Latin name, funerea, but I'm not sure. They're typically living on grape, like, riverbank grape, summer grape, that type of thing. If there's a grape in the neighborhood, you probably have this moth flying about, and it's a day flyer. So it's, you can see it's attracted to night lights, but it is more commonly seen as a day flyer. And the cool thing about this moth, they have a habit of, once that you spook them, they will land and immediately crawl on the underside of the leaf. It's sort of, again, a predator avoidance strategy. So it's really hard to get pictures of these in the day unless you're willing to lay on your belly and look upwards at the bottom side of a leaf. And then you have moths that are just mind-blowing. The pattern on this, when you see this fully extended, you cannot imagine how they develop scales in this pattern and for what purpose. This is one of the great mysteries, okay, you can imagine a plume moth shaped like this when you start looking at where they live and what they feed on, which are, very tiny perennial flowers typically that are out in open grasslands and fields. So not unlike the grass veneer moth, these plume moths have to be narrow and small to avoid getting picked off. But these guys, the Habraseini, I don't understand how and why they develop like this, but they're quite a sight to behold. And this is just one of many that, people say, oh, moths are just kind of boringly brown or gray. And I say, well, okay, don't call this boring. Thank you very much. Hook-tip moths, a very small group. Here's all 3 species of this family, Drepanidae. Very common. This one, at least, the common hook tip, you see at least 2 broods a year, sometimes 3 when you get south of sort of Massachusetts, Connecticut line. You get 3 broods of this in a year. They're very common. It's kissing cousin is typically a 1 or 2 brood up north. And then this one, which is more of a coastal species, only has 1 brood. It's a little bit more rare, but all 3 of these are unmistakable by virtue of this hooked tip to the wing, the drepanids. And then we get into the loopers, or the inchworms, as it were. All of these have inchworm type larvae that are anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches long. They're generally brown and gray and very camouflaged as they're laying on top of a twig on their way to the next meal. But as adults, they can have some pretty remarkable colors and patterns as well. You can't mistake in the Speranza Postulary. This guy is pretty darn common. It has 2 very large broods, and they're typically 3 or 4 weeks long. So it's hard to miss this white guy with the brown spots on it. And then, of course, you've got a lot of sort of lookalikes that you have to tease out if you want to do any kind of IDs. There's a group, this one here, the Hippogyrtus, that you almost have to go to DNA to identify it. Phygalias can be really tough. So you have to kind of look closer at these, and there's several hundred geometrids that make it a little bit confusing. I know a lot of lep people, Lepidoptera or lepidopterists, as it were, and they talk about loopers like they're scum or something. It's like, oh yeah, it's just another looper, I don't care. They're more interested in the sort of higher, more evolved, larger, colorful moths like the Saturns and the Sphinxes and stuff. But I like them all. There's any group that I like better than another. This fellow, which stands out like a sore thumb on a blank wall in your porch light, look at the pattern of this thing. And if you've ever seen this on the ground with leaves, I've got a couple of pictures of this. I should have put them in the slideshow. You cannot see these in nature in the day when they're in resting state. I mean, they just blend in so well. And this genus Litrosis is, we've only got 1 really good member here in the Northeast, but it's a huge family in the tropics. And you can imagine why. I mean, look at the patterns. And a lot of the Litrosis are that's their total, MO. They're camouflage moths. They live in the understory, and that's, they avoid predation very easily by virtue of that camouflage. But then you've got others that are flower mimics. This is a day-flying yellow flower, typically larval, or I should say nectary feeder. They like primrose and mullein and other yellowish flowers, and they kind of mimic the cabbage. Well, not so much the cabbage whites, but the mustards in terms of the butterfly group. That's a day-flying yellow sort of. But again, with this sort of broken up pattern of brown on yellow, they can be fairly well hidden, unlike their friend, the pale beauty moth here. That is, sticks right out. Another common group of geometers, which I think are perhaps the most colorful moth group, in terms of a genus anyway, is this guy right here. And there are about 6 or 7 species, and they're all just brightly colored and very highly marked, and you just can't mistake them. These are night flyers, whereas there's another group called the flower moths that are day flyers that are also colorful. So it'd be a toss-up between this genus and the flower moth genus. But because a lot of moths, like this, especially the geometers, are really intending to be camouflage as they fly about their natural environment during the nighttime. And so they're kind of hard to see until they come to the lights, and then they really stand out. Here's one that you probably all have seen, the tent caterpillars. We've got a forest tent caterpillar here and our eastern tent caterpillar there. These guys also have larval outbreaks, as you know, from time to time, but they're most well known for their tents. They're aggregating, larval developing cocoons, as you might call them, that form on the tips of hardwood trees every year. pretty reliable on any cherry that you've got in your yard, especially black cherry, but pin cherry, and they'll just, set up shop and live in that sort of tent as again, a predator avoidance technique. And then they'll eventually venture out from that tent as they get larger. And by the time they get to their second to last or last instar, they're on their own and they're looking for places to pupate. Both of these guys are very similarly colored, about 1.5 inches long in terms of their larvae, and both can have, dramatic effects in terms of defoliating hardwood trees from time to time. So we get a couple more groups. I mentioned the silk moths, and the question before was about the rosy maple moth, Dryocampa rubicunda. Dryo is the Greek root for oak, and the larvae of this guy, whoops, I'll go back. The larvae of this guy tends to eat on oak leaves, but will also feed on other hardwoods as well. There's only one other species that's sort of like this in the tiger moth family, but if you look close, you can't mistake it. And again, these guys are super common, super abundant. Interestingly, much more so as adults. It's kind of tough to find the larvae of these guys, even though they're brightly colored. I haven't come across too many of the Dryocampa larvae in the woods. And again, largely because they're up in the canopy. And unless I'm a bat or an arboreal mammal, it's kind of hard to get up into the canopy and see these things chewing away. Lunas have to be one of my favorites, just because of the remarkable color and the size, the pattern, and look at those pectinate antennae. That is the classic combed filamentous, bipectinate. You have combs on each side of the antennal strand. It's just a classic set of antennae that, this is almost 1 inch long, because considering that the wingspan here is about 6.5 to 7 inches wide, the entire moth is about 6.5 inches as long as well. And they're only considered smaller than the Cecropia polyphemus because they do have an elongate tail instead of a broad winged tail. And so that's, their surface area is a little smaller, but in end to end and length or width measurements, they tend to be our largest. These guys are huge, and they're day flyers in mixed hardwoods for only about a week. They're one of the shorter lived moth species, so you can pretty much predict when they're going to come out. The first warm, rainy night in June will sort of kick them into gear, and you'll have them for about a week to 10 days. And that's it. It's a pretty short flight period, and like most other Saturnids like this guy, you really have a small window to see them, unlike this rosy maple moth, which will be flying for a good solid 3 weeks or so. So they, these command a lot more attention. They're beautiful, they're large. They're really stunning to see when you have them flying through the woods, and I'm sure many of you probably have seen these guys. All right, getting closer, we've got a couple more groups. The Sphinx Maws. These are, of course, most well known as the hornworms, right? So this is your northern pine looper, otherwise known as a northern hornworm. Some people call this the tobacco hornworm, even though it's not really a tobacco obligate species. This fellow will chow down tomatoes with no problem, and beans and a number of other garden vegetables. And I'm sure many of you have seen hornworms if you do grow leafy vegetables. You'll see them in a lot of different species, a lot of your cabbages as well. Some of them, though, when you let the hornworm pupate and emerge as adults, become quite attractive, with some interesting wing patterns, some lateral wing flaps, as it were. Hind wings are sticking out here, and they're really a distinctively colorful and attractive species. This guy, the northern pine a Sphinx is about 3.5 inches long. This one's about 2.5 inches long. So, pretty large bugs as they are when they emerge as adults. A closely related moth family, the prominents, in their own family, and characterized usually by pretty furry thoraxes. Perhaps the most famous one is this one here in the lower right, which you will recognize by the name woolly bear. So if you've ever wondered what a woolly bear looks like when it's an adult, here it is. And that's a pretty attractive bug in my book. You've got a pretty furry thorax, brightly colored abdomen with these black spots, both on the hind wing and on the center part of the abdomen, typical discal spots and lines. It's a beautiful, beautiful adult, not unlike some of these other notodonts or prominent moths. This is Nedatta. Some of these I don't have common names for, and yeah, whatever. They're nonetheless pretty distinctive and easy to see. Tiger moths, we get into, it's actually Erebidi. It's been changed, and it's now the tiger moth subfamily, but also come in very distinctive patterns, shapes, sizes. The giant leopard moth is probably one of the best known tiger moths in terms of its distinguishing features, but I personally like these guys here, and these are variously known as the Grammia tiger moths, all now in the genus Appenthesis. This one a little bit beat up, but one of the common pine barrens associates that we get in these dry habitats, not unlike the Oregon cycnia, which is also a pinelands associate. And look at that. The abdomen is really the keynote feature of that guy. But look at this one, the haploids. These guys are just spectacular, mostly living in large river systems and floodplains and along the sandy banks of rivers, muddy banks sometimes. Interesting habitat selection for something that is that diagnostic. And then, of course, we have a number of white day-flying moths that we see out and about. These guys are flying as we speak. And there's a few of those species as well. All right, so we're down to the owlet moth group, and we're closing in on our hour. This is a huge group, like I said, over 300 species in the Northeast, and we have many, many different kinds. Notice that there are there are two primary families, Erebidi, and then a bunch of subfamilies. And some of these guys, like the deltoid shape of these, are very triangular. That sort of characterizes this subfamily Herminiinae. And there's a whole host of these that are pretty much detritivores, right? So this is that group I was mentioning, live in the leaf litter. Their larvae eat dead leaves and dying leaves, many of which are fungally associated. That is to say, the leaves are not the dry, crispy surface leaves, but they're the moldy, fungal inhabited, rotting leaves beneath the surface. And their entire life cycle is lived out there. This one is really easy to see right now in the woods as they fly up from the leaf litter as you walk through the woods. And that's the case with several of these in the Herminiinae. Other owlet moths include these guys, and you can see there's just a wide variety of shapes, colors, patterns. Mostly are distinct and mostly allow you to use your sort of eye naturalist eye to pick out what the species is, with the exception of this one here, which I think they probably named this Zolai Horadus because it was so horrid to try and key out. This is one of the more common owlets in the Catocalinae, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful bug. I mean, the lines, there can be 20 different lines, parallel lines, wavy lines in the back part of this bug. but it does vary in color. And the Zales, spelled Z-A-L-E, are some of the most fascinating owlets we've got because they tend to be very specific to certain habitats. I think in this group, we've got at least 3 state-listed rare species. And some of those are pine barrens associates. So it's a fascinating group. No less so than the yellowhorn group, which is in the Pantheon. This guy, bright golden yellow antennae. The only really owlet moth, the only moths I know that have this coloration. So regardless of the pattern, there are 3 species, 2 of which occur here. Regardless of pattern, you can always identify them by the coloration of the antennae. And then you've got these. I remember this guy was right on the Science Center entrance. We had a whole sort of, roost of these one night during the BioBlitz 12 years ago. And this is pretty common right there at the Science Center. So these are all, pretty common bugs as they are in our region. The dart moths, which have these sort of blackish lines to them. Sometimes they're sort of, wide lines, not defined. Otherwise, they're like this lobelia dart moth is really quite a pattern. And you've got a variety. These are all dart moths in the Acronictinae, and they're a fascinating group as well. Just a beautiful set of patterns among them all. The cuculins are the early flyers, as I mentioned, the overwintering as adults. And here's the proof of the pudding. I pulled this one out of the sap bucket and lay it on the deck. Yeah, dripping sap. That's what their favorite food, and all of these are factor into that post-winter, early spring emergence. Sometimes as early as February, but mostly by the middle of March, flying no later than the end of April in a given year. And then 2 left, the Hadenines or Hadeninae subfamily of the Noctuats. There's some beautiful moths in this group as well, some real tough ones to identify as well, but lots of different patterns and several dozen species in that group, and then several dozen species in this this final group. The Hadenines here and the Noctuids, these 2 guys here. And some really incredible patterns on some of them that make them very easy to identify when you get a picture of them. So that is pretty much it. I appreciate all of your patience and good attention. Hopefully you've gotten to appreciate a few of the moth groups, and I'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks, Rick. We do have several questions, and I'll let folks know we can allow you to talk if you want to directly ask your question. Just let me know in the chat. And let's see, Eileen had a question early on.
Okay.
She was wondering if the small yellow one, so she's wondering if it's a moth or a butterfly, the small yellow one flying around these days, is that a moth or a butterfly? And I don't know if, Eileen, you got to see that in his slideshow and have your question answered there or not. And I don't know if that's enough of information for you.
Yeah, there's a lot of small yellow ones. And it depends on the color yellow. And maybe you could, I think, be a little more specific in terms of size and color of yellow, because we've got, I showed the one of the crocus geometer, which is Xanthotype. That's a bright yellow with the sort of light brownish spots on it. That's flying around right now in the daytime, but that's not small. That's about 1.5 inches across. We do have a bunch of the pale yellow small guys in the pastures, but if you could be more specific, I might be able to help you out. Okay,
we've got several other questions in the Q&A, so we'll start with there. Michelle's wondering, she said she was in Western New York last week, and the gypsy moths were destroying the foliage and the hillsides were brown. And she was wondering if that's a common cyclic occurrence or something novel. She hadn't remembered seeing that before. And I know you referenced the 80 outbreak.
Yeah, it's sort of 6 to 7 to 10 years, they say, average cycle when you can imagine, okay, so you got a fungus that's eating on the larvae. Well, that fungus might go through a drought period and die off, and then the larvae survive. And if the larvae hatch and they fly, then the adults reproduce, better that year. And so you might have a little bit of an outbreak. But as soon as that outbreak, pops, in normal years, the fungus catches up pretty quickly, gets attached to actually the eggs and starts to infect the eggs before the larvae even hatch. So in most years, I'd say that's the common cycle. But as I said, last year, the drought really kicked back the fungus quite a bit. The Gypsy Moths are double brooders. That the hillside I showed the picture of, that looked pretty bad. But I can tell you, when I went out in the woods up at Tin Mountain on Tuesday, I had no problem sweeping up adults. And so we got another brood of adults hatching or flying right now, and they're laying eggs, and those larvae are going to be eating whatever leaves are left on those trees that started on the first brood. So it's quite a serious pest this year in certain areas.
And this is my question. What's the range of gypsy moth? How far spread are they?
That's a really good one. I know that they get up into central Ontario, as far north as eastern Quebec, west to the middle, sort of Midwest. I would say probably Wisconsin, limited tree kind of deal, and then all the way south. I don't think there's many in Florida, but certainly they are present in North Carolina and the northern part of the Gulf states. So that's approximately their range.
Great, thanks.
And Europe. I mean, I'm just saying North America because they were introduced from
right.
Europe.
Yes. Yeah. No, I meant North America. Yeah, thanks. Emma is wondering if camouflage is one of their only means of defense. Why are some of them brightly colored?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And, Emma, I'm going to be able to answer like only partially, in terms of whether we understand that. Like the silk moths, that's a classic. Silk moths are gigantic. They're often very brightly colored and distinctively patterned. And I suspect that the fact that we only have a few species is partly a result of that. If you think about the moths that are really abundant, very common, can have periodic outbreaks as pests, they're all pretty well camouflaged. They don't stand out too much. Even our flower moths, which, as I mentioned before, very, very, very colorful. Well, they're mostly day flyers feeding on the nectar of flowers. And so they can afford to have that colored pattern because they're often, backdropped by some flower that's in the same sort of, pattern or coloration. So I think that's where at least the day flying moths that are colorful can afford to be colorful. And you'll note that most of the really common and abundant moths are generally brownish or grayish, and they have that sort of a bland patterning that allows them to sit into their roosting site during the day. That's the dominant condition. So yeah.
Great. Linda, I'm going to share in Linda's frustration of sometimes trying to look up a moth and identify it. She's wondering if there is much variation among individuals. She says, when I look many up, I can't find one that looks just like the one that I found.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me, and it brings to mind my very oft repeated point about mushrooms, right? Mushrooms, as many of you know, have, not unlike moths, a life cycle, and they start out small and they get larger. And a young mushroom looks nothing like an old mushroom of the same species. And the same thing goes with moths. What happens, as you can see, even in this last picture, let's see. Yeah, so the right two pictures here is Protostortes ovidica, and they're both the same species. Look at the difference in the coloration and the patterning. They're the same species, and that makes it somewhat challenging. Then you get this one next to it, which only has a couple of identifying features. Orthotes modesta has just a few features that you can identify it to species, but otherwise a lot of these scales have fallen off because it's an old guy like me. The hair is falling off. So, that's what happens with these guys. It can be really, really challenging, especially if you get an old individual. I mean, I've seen those Rosy maple moths almost purely white, pale, pale yellow, lost all their pink. As these guys get older, in their second or third week of life, they drop their scales or they get them rubbed off, or, some bird takes half of their wing off. And, so it can be very, very challenging. And you really want to find a good condition moth like these two guys in the Noctuatae, that, if you're going to match it up. And just one more thing, Audrey, I'll say about Linda's question is that for references, the sort of updated guide, that's David Beatty and Seabrook Leckie, and that's I don't know if I can. Yeah, there it is. Whatever, it's a field guide. That one, the field guide to moths, that's pretty good start. But don't forget the online resources. And I use Moth Photographers Group primarily as the ID source, but you can also use iNaturalist, and you can post a picture like you see here of the moth and let someone else identify it or help you out. You can post what you think it is, and then either through bugguide.net or iNaturalist or this new website called LepSnap, lep.snap, LepSnap, you can get some computer-generated matchups that gives you some pretty good, pretty reliable identifications for questionable moths.
Cool. Those are great resources.
Yeah.
2 more questions. One, which we promised people you would answer, so now you have to. In the description, we said you would. Why are moths attracted to light?
Yeah. Okay. So, there's a lot of theories about that, and I would encourage you to read John Himmelman's review of his answer to that very basic question. Yeah. So one of those theories, and I'm not saying there's a definitive answer. Okay. I mean, you can base it on a chemical, actually, a chemical, chemophysiological response to light that draws their sensory organs towards that source of light. But why it's, it doesn't turn off, why that chemical doesn't shut off, why the photons are actually stimulating the release of that neurotransmitter, which communicates to their very small brain to fly towards it. I can't answer that entirely, and I've only, again, read several different sort of theories. There's the usual suspects. Well, they're seeking light so that they can get to the top of the canopy and avoid predation in the understory. No, they're seeking light because if they're higher up in the ecosystem, wherever their eggs land, they'll have a greater opportunity for the larvae to survive. I don't buy it. But these are some of the theories that have been posited for why they are attracted to light. Sorry, I can't give you the definitive on that one.
Kind of an interesting thing for a nocturnal creature, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's sort of like the same ilk of a question that I get a lot is, why do mushrooms have color? Lots of theories, but no definitive answers.
All right, one last question from Dom that is a great one to end on, I think. Okay. He's asking, how important are moths as pollinators as compared to butterflies and native bees?
Super important. In fact, more important. And that's one of the, I think one of the biggest contributions to understanding moths that we can make. Because it's not just that we have, bees are getting a lot of attention, obviously, because if you're growing almonds and you got $1 billion industry, you want to have pollinators succeed in making your bottom line. But if you're just growing trees and you're harvesting trees, you're not really thinking about all the moths that are pollinating the tree flowers that produce the next generation to succeed, you know, from your logging attempt or whatever. So it's an undervalued, unappreciated role that moths play as pollinators. They do the plurality of the pollination of trees and shrubs, and a great deal of the pollination of herbaceous plants. But of course, as you get into the larger, showier flowering herbaceous plants, then yes, you have wasps, beetles, and bees, you know, the true bees out there doing the yeoman's job. Not that moths are not present, they are, but you know, the flower moths are a small percentage of the normal herbaceous pollinators. It's just that the moths are doing such a great job with the trees and shrubs that we can't underestimate that. Great final question, Audrey. Appreciate all of your good thinking about that.
Yeah, thanks, Dom, for that one. Well, Rick, we really appreciate you joining us tonight. That was fascinating, and I hope maybe next summer we can get you out in person and
Yeah,
some real moths. That would be
that
really
would be fun. Yeah, hang a couple sheets, do some black lights, and take it away. Have some in-person fun.
Yes, yeah, we'll keep that in mind, and hopefully we can do that. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It was really a pleasure to have you all here, and we appreciate your questions and your comments, and we'll see you next time.
Okie dokie.
Thank you, Rick. Have a good night.